the Ethiopian Educational Information and Communication Technology presents Educational Satellite Television Programs.
Hello, teacher. Hello, students. Welcome to today's lesson on diffusion. In our last lesson, we learned about permeability of the cell membrane. We discovered the cell membrane is semi-permeable, and we discussed the functions of the membrane. We also learned about the concept of concentration and defined the term concentration gradient. Today, we will learn about diffusion. We will define the process and discuss the concentration gradient of diffusion. Students, are you ready to begin? Diffusion describes when particles of a gas or substances in a solution spread out. Diffusion is the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. Students, based on what we learned from our previous lesson, please explain the concept of concentration.
Students, let's get ready. Begin. Time's up. Let's get back to our lesson.
Hello, everyone. I hope you were able to recall the information we learned in our last lesson. Concentration is a way of measuring how many particles of a substance are in one place. In addition to concentration, we also learned about concentration gradient in our last lesson. The concentration gradient is defined as the difference in concentration between two areas. Typically, the greater the difference in concentration, the quicker the rate of diffusion will be. Diffusion happens because of random movements between particles in a solution. The particles move around and knock into one another. As the particles move randomly, more particles travel to the areas of low concentration. Therefore, the particles' overall movement is from areas of high concentration to areas of lower concentration. Concentration affects the rate of diffusion. Temperature also affects the rate of diffusion. If the temperature increases, the particles move quicker, creating more random movement. As random movement of particles speed up, diffusion will take place more rapidly. Let us use the example of copper sulfate diffusing in water. The blue circles represent copper sulfate, and the yellow circles represent water. As you can see, when the copper sulfate is added to the water, initially the copper sulfate does not mix with the water. As the copper sulfate particles begin to move and collide with one another, they start to mix with the water particles. The more the copper sulfate particles move randomly, the more they spread out. Ultimately, the copper sulfate particles mix with the water particles and diffusion is complete. Diffusion is a passive process. This means that diffusion does not require energy to take place. Since it takes place along the concentration gradient, which means it goes from high to low concentration. Now that we know how the process of diffusion works, why do you think this process is important for cells? Take a few minutes to discuss your ideas with a partner.
Students, let's get ready. Begin. Time's up. Let's get back to our lesson.
Welcome back, students. I wonder what some of your ideas were. Diffusion is important for cells because it allows them to get nutrients and release waste without the use of energy. Many necessary substances move across the cell membrane by diffusion. Breathing in fresh air is an example of how diffusion functions. Air that is inhaled contains more oxygen than the blood inside the lungs. The oxygen moves from a region of high concentration to a region of lower concentration. It moves from the lungs into the bloodstream. Oxygen can then be carried through the bloodstream to the tissues that need it for energy. The carbon dioxide that is produced by the cells passes out by diffusion as well. Diffusion is a slow process. Some cells adapt to make diffusion more efficient. As substances move in and out across the cell membrane, the most common adaptation is an increase of the surface area of the cell membrane. Since only a limited amount of particles diffuse over a given surface, increasing the surface area means more room for diffusion to take place. Tissues and organs adapt in similar ways to ensure diffusion happens efficiently. Before we conclude our lesson for today, let us do an activity to review what we have learned. Please fill in the blanks with the correct words to complete the sentences.
Students, let's get ready. Begin. Time's up. Let's get back to our lesson.
Welcome back, students. How did you do? Let us go over the answers together. Diffusion is the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Diffusion takes place over the semi-permeable cell membrane. The rate of diffusion is affected by concentration and temperature. Diffusion is a passive process. Great work, everyone. We have reached the end of our lesson. Today, we learned about the process of diffusion. We discussed the terms concentration and concentration gradient. We learned how diffusion works, what affects diffusion, and how the cell adapts to make the process more efficient. Until next time, thank you, teacher. Thank you, students.